The solution is impossible.
You're telling me I'm wrong?
Yes.
The first thing everyone heard was the laughter, but the last thing they remembered was the silence. It began at 4:17 on a Thursday afternoon inside Sanders Hall, where 300 students, visiting scholars, and faculty members had gathered for what Professor William Harrington called a demonstration of intellectual limits. The room was warm from the crowd, polished wood glowing under old brass lights, rain tapping against the tall windows like impatient fingers. At the front of the lecture hall, a blackboard stretched nearly from wall to wall, covered in white symbols so dense they looked less like mathematics and more like a storm frozen in chalk. Harrington stood before it in a charcoal suit, one hand tucked into his pocket, the other holding a piece of chalk like a conductor's baton. He was tall, silver-haired, and certain in the way only powerful men become certain after decades of being applauded. Behind him, written in neat capital letters, were the words "The Harrington Conjecture." For 6 weeks, his graduate seminar had wrestled with it. For 6 weeks, no one had solved it. Not the doctoral candidates. Not the visiting fellows from Princeton. Not even the 2 senior professors who had quietly stayed late after class, pretending they were only curious. Harrington loved that. He loved watching brilliant people fail in front of him. He loved the way the room tightened whenever he turned toward the board. But that afternoon, his eyes were not on his students. They were fixed on the back of the hall, where a black woman in a gray janitor's uniform was standing beside a yellow cleaning cart, one hand resting on a mop handle, her gaze lifted toward the equation. Her name tag read Evelyn Carter. Most people in the building knew her only as Ms. Carter, the quiet woman who cleaned the lecture halls after seminars and never interrupted anyone. She was 42 years old, with tired eyes, calm hands, and a way of moving through Harvard as if she knew how to disappear before anyone asked her to. She had come in early because maintenance had called about spilled coffee near the rear aisle. She was supposed to mop the floor, empty the trash, and leave before the reception began downstairs. But then she saw the board. For a few seconds, the world around her narrowed. The whispers, the rain, the soft hum of the projector, all of it faded behind the shape of the equation. Something about the third line was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong. A term had been forced where it did not belong, like a locked door painted onto a wall. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the mop handle. She did not mean to stare. She did not mean to step closer. But Harrington noticed. His voice cut through the room, smooth and sharp. "Careful, Miss Carter," he said into the microphone. "That equation has broken better minds than yours." A ripple of laughter moved across the lecture hall, first from the front rows, then higher into the balcony. Evelyn lowered her eyes, the way she had trained herself to do over 15 long years. She turned the mop slightly, ready to go back to work, ready to let the moment pass like so many others. But Harrington was enjoying himself now. "No, no," he said, smiling as he walked toward the edge of the stage. "Please don't stop on my account. I find curiosity charming, even when it wanders into rooms where it has no qualifications." More laughter. A student in the third row lifted his phone. Another whispered, "This is brutal." Maya Reynolds, a first-year graduate student sitting near the aisle, did not laugh. She watched Evelyn's face and saw something there that no one else seemed to notice. Not shame. Not confusion. Recognition. Harrington reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, holding it up between 2 fingers. "I'll make this interesting," he said. $100 says our janitor cannot explain the first symbol on that board, let alone solve the problem. The room shifted from laughter into anticipation, the cruel kind that waits for someone to be embarrassed. Evelyn stood very still. The mop bucket wheels gave a tiny squeak as her hand left the handle. She looked at the money, then at the board, then at Harrington. Her voice was quiet, but somehow it reached farther than his microphone. "Do you want me to explain it, Professor?" she asked, "or correct it?" The laughter stopped so quickly it felt as if someone had closed a door. For one long second, no one in Sanders Hall moved. Professor William Harrington still held the $100 bill in the air, but his smile had thinned. It was not the answer he had expected. He had expected nervousness, maybe an apology, perhaps the familiar lowering of the eyes from someone who had been reminded of her place in a room built for people with titles before their names. Instead, Evelyn Carter stood at the rear aisle with her cleaning cart beside her and her shoulders perfectly still, as if the laughter had passed around her without ever touching her. Harrington let out a small breath through his nose, then folded the bill and slipped it back into his wallet. "Correct it," he repeated, letting the words hang just long enough to make them sound ridiculous. That is quite a claim from someone who has been listening to half a lecture from behind a mop bucket. A few students laughed again, but softly this time, unsure whether the room was still safe for laughter. Evelyn did not respond immediately. Her eyes moved past him to the board, tracing the symbols from left to right, then back again, like a musician hearing a wrong note in a familiar song. The equation was not impossible because it was too advanced. It was impossible because it had been built around a mistake, and the mistake was protected by Harrington's reputation. That was the dangerous part. In places like Harvard, wrong ideas did not always fall when they were proven wrong. Sometimes they stood for years because powerful people were standing in front of them. Maya Reynolds felt her heartbeat pick up. She had asked about that same third line 20 minutes earlier, carefully, politely, the way first-year students ask questions when they know one wrong tone can follow them for the rest of the semester. Harrington had smiled at her then, the same polished smile he was wearing now, and told her she was confusing intuition with understanding. The room had moved on. Maya had written nothing for the next 10 minutes. Now this quiet woman in a gray uniform had seen the same flaw from the back of the hall. Harrington turned toward the audience, widening his arms as if inviting them into the joke. "Since we are apparently holding open auditions for the mathematics department, perhaps Miss Carter would like to tell us where the error is." Evelyn looked down at her hands. The skin across her knuckles was dry from cleaning solution, and a faint white line of soap powder clung beneath one fingernail. Hands like hers were invisible in this building unless something was spilled, broken, or out of place. She had spent years passing through offices where people discussed brilliance as if it only arrived wearing tweed, carrying grant money, speaking in confident sentences that never had to defend their right to exist. She had cleaned chalk dust from floors beneath portraits of men who had been called geniuses for ideas they had borrowed, refined, renamed, and framed. And for 15 years, she had told herself silence was peace. Silence paid the rent. Silence kept her mother's medical bills from becoming eviction notices. Silence let her work nights and leave before the morning crowds arrived. But silence also had a cost. It collected inside the chest. It grew heavy. Harrington stepped down from the platform and walked a few feet up the aisle, stopping where the polished wood met the first row of seats. "Come now, Miss Carter," he said. "Do not be shy. This is Harvard. We welcome bold thinking, provided it can survive scrutiny." The word sounded noble, but his eyes were cold with amusement. Evelyn finally moved. Not toward the exit. Not back to the spill by the rear aisle. She reached into the side pocket of her cleaning cart and pulled out a folded pair of thin disposable gloves, removed them slowly, and placed them beside the mop handle. The small gesture made the room even quieter. It was the kind of quiet that arrives before people understand why they are holding their breath. Then Evelyn stepped into the aisle. Her shoes made almost no sound against the floor. Students turned as she passed them. Some lowered their phones. Others raised them higher. Maya watched her closely, and for the first time all afternoon, hope and fear twisted together in her stomach. Evelyn reached the front row. And stopped beneath the edge of the stage. Up close, Harrington noticed details he had never bothered to see before: her steady breathing, the calm focus in her eyes, the complete absence of embarrassment. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Evelyn looked past him at the board and spoke in that same quiet voice. "The error is not in the final transformation," she said. "It begins in the assumption before it." The room froze. Harrington's face barely changed, but the chalk in his hand shifted. Maya sat forward. Somewhere in the balcony, someone whispered, "Wait, what did she just say?" Evelyn lifted her eyes to the third line of the equation, and the past she had spent 15 years burying began to rise. The third line had always been the trap. Evelyn could see it now as clearly as she had seen it 15 years earlier in a different room, under different lights, when her name was still spoken with possibility instead of surprise. The symbol Harrington had built his argument around looked harmless to anyone reading quickly, a small boundary condition tucked between two longer expressions, but mathematics did not care how elegant a mistake appeared. A false assumption remained false even when written by a famous man in perfect chalk. Evelyn stood beneath the board without climbing onto the platform, her eyes following the curve of the notation. The lecture hall seemed larger from the front, almost cathedral-like, with rows rising above her and faces stacked into the shadows. For years she had cleaned this room after everyone left. She knew which seats collected pencil shavings, which windows rattled in winter, which corner of the stage held dust no vacuum ever reached. She knew Sanders Hall by touch, by routine, by the quiet labor no one praised because it was only noticed when it was not done. But standing there now, with every eye on her, she felt something shift. The room was no longer a place she maintained. It was a place that had to answer her. Professor Harrington gave a short, controlled laugh. "Before the assumption," he said, as if repeating the phrase would expose it as nonsense. "That is fascinating, Ms. Carter. Please, enlighten us. Which assumption has escaped an entire department?" Evelyn turned to him. "The one you needed to be true." A few people inhaled sharply. Harrington's jaw tightened, but only for a second. He had built a career on never looking shaken in public. "That is not an explanation," he said. "It is theater." Evelyn nodded once, almost gently. "Then let us remove the theater." She stepped onto the platform. The old floorboards made a quiet sound beneath her shoes. At the chalk rail, she paused before touching anything, as if crossing an invisible line. Her hand hovered over the white chalk, then selected a short piece worn down by earlier use. That detail alone made several students lean forward. She did not choose the fresh chalk in the box. She chose the broken piece, the one everyone else had ignored. Maya Reynolds felt tears sting her eyes and did not understand why. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was the unbearable dignity of watching someone mocked in public refuse to become small. Or maybe it was because, for the first time since arriving at Harvard, Maya saw a black woman at the front of that room who did not ask permission to belong there. Evelyn lifted the chalk and circled the third line. One clean motion. Not hesitant. Not decorative. Precise. "Here," she said. The word landed harder than Harrington expected. A doctoral student in the second row frowned and bent over his notes. Another opened his laptop and began typing quickly. Professor Nathaniel Brooks, seated near the side wall with a folded program in his lap, adjusted his glasses. He had come to the lecture out of professional courtesy and mild boredom. Now his attention sharpened. Something about Evelyn's posture was familiar. Not her face, not yet, but the way she stood before a board, slightly angled, shoulders relaxed, as if the equation were not an enemy but a conversation interrupted too soon. Evelyn wrote beneath Harrington's third line, her chalk moving softly at first. She did not solve the problem. Not yet. She rewound it. She pulled the expression backward, step by step, exposing the hidden dependency Harrington had treated as independent. The board began to change under her hand. What had looked like a finished structure started to resemble scaffolding around an empty center. Harrington took one step closer. You are misreading the notation, he said. Evelyn did not look at him. No, Professor. I am reading what it says, not what your reputation asks it to say. The room went utterly still. Outside, the rain kept tapping against the glass. Inside, the only sound was the chalk in Evelyn Carter's hand, drawing a door through a wall everyone else had mistaken for stone. Evelyn erased nothing at first. That was what unsettled the room. She did not rush to replace Harrington's work with her own, did not cover the board in frantic symbols to prove she belonged there. She simply stood beside the mistake and let everyone see it. The circled third line remained exposed under the lecture hall lights, white chalk against black slate, small enough to have been missed and large enough to collapse everything built after it. Harrington's smile had disappeared completely now, though he tried to keep his voice even. This is a common misunderstanding among people unfamiliar with advanced boundary theory, he said. The dependency is implied by the transformation 2 lines later. Evelyn turned slightly, looking at the later transformation. It cannot be implied after it has already been used, she said. That is not theory. That is decoration. Somewhere in the middle rows, a student made a sound that was almost a laugh but stopped himself. Harrington heard it. His face tightened. For the first time all afternoon, the power in the room no longer moved cleanly toward him. It wavered, uncertain, looking for a new place to settle. Evelyn placed the chalk beneath the third line and began to write again, slower this time, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted them to follow. Every mark had purpose. Every symbol answered the one before it. The expression that Harrington had presented as untouchable began to open, not dramatically, not with noise, but with the quiet inevitability of a locked drawer sliding free. Maya Reynolds leaned over her notebook, copying as fast as she could, but soon she stopped. She was no longer taking notes. She was watching history step out of a uniform no one had respected. Professor Nathaniel Brooks stood halfway from his chair before realizing he had moved. His hand gripped the seat back in front of him. The method Evelyn was using was not standard, but it was not random either. He had seen its shape once, years ago, in a draft passed quietly between faculty offices before vanishing from every conversation. A draft by a young black mathematician whose questions had made senior scholars uncomfortable. A draft that had caused a brief storm, then a silence so complete that most people forgot there had ever been weather. Brooks stared at Evelyn's handwriting. The memory came back in pieces, a seminar room in winter, a nervous graduate student with brilliant eyes, pages covered in dense notation, and a title written in blue ink across the front. Carter Boundary Lemma. His breath caught. Evelyn continued writing. She had not heard Brooks stand. She had not looked at Maya, or the students recording from the aisle, or Harrington pacing near the edge of the platform like a man trapped outside his own argument. In her mind, she was not at Harvard anymore. She was 27, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed with a yellow legal pad on her knees, solving equations while the machine beside the bed clicked softly through the night. Her mother, Denise Carter, had worked 30 years as a nurse in Baltimore and believed two things with equal force: that bills had to be paid on time, and that her daughter's mind was a gift no one had the right to shrink. Back then, Evelyn had still believed that talent was enough. She believed if the proof was correct, the world would make room for it. Then came the conference, the closed-door meeting, the missing draft, the polite emails that stopped being answered, the fellowship that quietly disappeared. No one had shouted. No one had thrown her out. They had done something colder. They had turned her name into a complication and waited for poverty, exhaustion, and grief to finish the work. Evelyn's chalk paused. Not from doubt. From memory. Harrington seized on the silence. "Are we done?" he asked, too quickly. Evelyn looked at the board, then at him. "No," she said. "Now we get to the part you copied without understanding." The air in Sanders Hall seemed to leave the room. Brooks sat down slowly, his face pale with recognition. Maya covered her mouth. Harrington stared at Evelyn as if seeing her for the first time, and perhaps he was. Not the woman who emptied trash cans. Not the employee in the gray uniform. Not the convenient target for a joke. He was seeing the author of the door he had been pretending to unlock. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The sentence had already done what anger could not do. It had reached the one place Professor Harrington had protected most carefully, the space between what he knew and what he had claimed as his own. A thin murmur moved through Sanders Hall, traveling from the front rows to the balcony, then folding back on itself as students looked at one another, unsure whether they had just witnessed a misunderstanding or the beginning of a scandal. Harrington took one step toward the board. "That is a very serious accusation," he said, each word polished and cold. "I suggest you choose your next statement with care." Evelyn looked at him, then at the chalk in her hand. "I chose my statements 15 years ago," she said. "You chose which ones to publish." The murmur grew louder. A visiting scholar near the aisle lowered his glasses and leaned toward the colleague beside him. Maya Reynolds was no longer trying to hide her expression. Her eyes moved from Evelyn to Harrington to Professor Brooks, whose face carried the look of a man watching an old mistake return with a name attached to it. Harrington turned toward the audience, attempting to reclaim the room with a practiced smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is precisely why academic training matters. Mathematics is not a place for personal grievances. It is a discipline of proof." Evelyn nodded. "Then let us use proof." She turned back to the board and drew a vertical line beside Harrington's work, dividing the blackboard into two worlds. On the left was the famous conjecture, elegant, incomplete, and wrong. On the right, Evelyn began rebuilding the argument from the foundation. She did not write quickly. She wrote clearly. Every symbol seemed to settle into place as if it had been waiting years to be put back where it belonged. The graduate students who had laughed earlier were now silent, some bent over notebooks, others frozen with their phones half raised. A teaching assistant in the second row whispered, "That correction actually works." Harrington heard it and turned sharply. The assistant looked down. But the damage had been done. The room had begun to think without his permission. Evelyn moved to the next line. "If the boundary term is treated as independent, the result appears unsolvable," she said. "That is why your class has been circling the same wall for 6 weeks. But if the dependency is restored here, the equation does not resist. It opens." Brooks closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered the phrase. It opens. Evelyn had said it at a seminar years ago when a senior professor dismissed her model as too intuitive. She had smiled then, younger, hopeful, unaware that brilliance could make enemies before it made allies. When Brooks opened his eyes again, Evelyn was writing the proof exactly as he remembered it, only cleaner, sharper, aged by pain and patience. Harrington's confidence began to thin in visible layers. He glanced at the clock above the rear doors, then at the side entrance where faculty often slipped out unnoticed. But there was nowhere to go. The cameras were still recording. The students were still watching. The board was still changing. Evelyn reached the center of the proof and paused beside a compact expression Harrington had used in 2 published papers, 3 invited lectures, and the grant proposal that made him untouchable in the department. She tapped it once with the chalk. "This shortcut," she said, "only makes sense if you know the unpublished lemma behind it." Harrington's face lost color. Maya saw it happen and sat up straighter. The students saw it too. So did Brooks. For years, Harrington's authority had filled every room before he entered it. Now it seemed to shrink under the sound of a single piece of chalk. Evelyn wrote 3 words in the upper right corner of the board, Carter Boundary Lemma. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The name sat there, plain and undeniable, like a signature uncovered beneath a layer of paint. Harrington stared at it, and the silence became heavier than any accusation. Evelyn placed the chalk beneath the name and finished the missing step. The impossible equation was no longer impossible. It had simply been waiting for the woman everyone had mistaken for invisible. For a moment, the proof seemed to breathe on the board. Evelyn stepped back just enough for the room to see the whole structure, from Harrington's broken assumption on the left to the restored solution on the right. The contrast was so clear now that even students who had been lost in the earlier lecture could feel the difference. One side strained to sound profound. The other side simply worked. Professor Harrington stood near the edge of the platform with his hands at his sides, no longer performing confidence, no longer smiling for the crowd. His eyes moved over the words Carter boundary lemma as if he could erase them by refusing to blink. But the name remained. It belonged there. It had always belonged there. Evelyn placed the chalk on the rail and turned toward the audience. The reason the equation collapses under your version, she said, is because the dependency was removed to make the result look original. But mathematics remembers what people try to hide. That sentence moved through the hall more quietly than thunder, but with the same force. Professor Brooks rose fully now. His chair gave a soft scrape against the floor, and every head near him turned. He was 71, retired but still respected, one of the few people in the department whose silence could command more attention than a younger man's speech. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Evelyn. "Your name is Evelyn Carter," he said, not as a question, but as a confession arriving late. Evelyn met his eyes. It was then, too. Brooks closed his mouth, and the sadness on his face said more than any apology could have. 15 years returned to the room in pieces. A missing fellowship. A vanished draft. A young scholar dismissed as difficult when she asked why her work had appeared in someone else's presentation. An internal review that never became public. A department that called it miscommunication because miscommunication sounded cleaner than theft. Most of the students did not know those details yet, but they felt the shape of them. They heard it in Brooks's voice. They saw it in Harrington's stillness. Maya Reynolds opened her laptop with trembling hands and searched the university archive. Carter boundary lemma. Nothing came up at first. Then she tried Evelyn Carter mathematics boundary dependency. An old conference program loaded slowly, dated 15 years earlier, scanned crookedly in gray and white. There it was, buried on page 14 between two talks that had gone on to become published papers. Evelyn Denise Carter, Graduate Research Fellow, Boundary Dependencies in Nonlinear Systems. Maya whispered, "Oh my goodness." The student beside her leaned over. Within seconds, the file was spreading across the room from screen to screen. Phones lowered, then rose again, not to mock Evelyn, but to capture Harrington's face as the past reached him in real time. Harrington finally spoke. A conference abstract is not a proof of ownership. His voice was thinner now, but still sharp enough to search for escape. Evelyn nodded. "No, it is not." She reached into the pocket of her gray uniform and pulled out a small black notebook, its corners worn soft, its elastic band stretched from years of use. "That is why I kept the drafts." The room changed again. Not louder. Deeper. The kind of silence that understands it is standing at the edge of something irreversible. Evelyn opened the notebook with careful hands. Inside were pages filled with ink, dates, diagrams, and equations written in the same unmistakable structure now standing on the board. Some pages had hospital parking receipts tucked between them. Others had coffee stains, rent calculations, and small notes in the margin written during years when scholarship had to survive beside survival. She turned to a page dated 15 years earlier and held it up. The proof was there. Not similar. Not inspired. There. Harrington stared at the notebook, and for the first time, he looked less like a professor defending a theory and more like a man watching a locked door open from the inside. Evelyn closed the notebook and rested it against her chest. "You published the staircase," she said. "But I built the first step." Brooks lowered his head. Maya's eyes filled, but she did not look away. Across Sanders Hall, students who had laughed less than 10 minutes earlier now sat with the uncomfortable knowledge that they had been part of the wrong side of the story. Evelyn turned back to the board, picked up the chalk one final time, and wrote the last line of the solution beneath her name. 2 minutes had been enough to solve the equation. But it would take Harvard much longer to solve what it had allowed to happen. The last line landed beneath Evelyn Carter's name with a quiet finality that no applause could have improved. For several seconds, Sanders Hall did not know what to do with itself. The room had been built for lectures, for certainty, for the orderly transfer of knowledge from the elevated stage to the listening seats below. It had not been built for a woman in a janitor's uniform to stand at the board and return a stolen idea to its rightful origin. Professor Harrington turned toward Professor Brooks as if searching for rescue from someone old enough to understand the rules of institutional survival. Brooks did understand them. That was why he looked so ashamed. "Nathaniel," Harrington said, forcing a thin laugh, "surely you are not suggesting that a forgotten abstract and a personal notebook overturn years of published scholarship?" Brooks looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said softly. "I am suggesting we should have listened to her when she was standing in front of us the first time." The words did not explode. They settled. That made them worse. A graduate student near the front whispered, "The first time." Maya Reynolds had already found another archived file, this one from an old departmental symposium. The scan was grainy, but the date was clear. 15 years earlier. Evelyn Carter's name appeared again, listed beside a presentation on nonlinear boundary dependencies. Below it, in a later program from the following year, was Harrington's keynote with nearly the same phrasing, except one name was missing. Maya's fingers moved faster across the keyboard. She was not just searching anymore. She was assembling a trail. Around her, other students began doing the same. The room that had mocked Evelyn was becoming a witness against the man who had invited them to laugh. Harrington noticed the screens glowing. His voice sharpened. "This is irresponsible. None of you understand the publication history. Academic development is collaborative. Ideas evolve." Evelyn turned from the board. "Ideas evolve," she said. "Names disappear." That stopped him again. Outside, rain streaked the windows in silver lines, blurring the Harvard yard beyond the glass. Inside, the board remained clear, merciless, and full of evidence. Harrington looked at the equation as though it had betrayed him, but equations do not betray people. They reveal what has been done to them. Professor Brooks stepped into the aisle and faced the room. "I remember the draft," he said. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of choosing truth too late. It circulated privately before review. Evelyn questioned why her citations were removed. She asked for a formal inquiry. Some of us told ourselves it was a dispute over interpretation. He paused, then looked at Evelyn. It was not. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before. It had grief in it. It had recognition. It had the uncomfortable sound of people realizing that injustice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters through committee language, unanswered emails, polite delays, and rooms where no one wants to risk their position by saying what they know. Evelyn lowered her gaze to the black notebook in her hands. She had imagined this moment many times over the years, usually while pushing a cleaning cart through empty hallways after midnight. In those imagined versions, she had spoken perfectly. She had made them all understand. She had felt vindicated, maybe even free. But standing there now, she felt something quieter. Not victory. Not revenge. Just the strange ache of being believed after it no longer had the power to return. What was lost? Harrington turned toward the side exit. Dean Charles Whitmore had appeared there, drawn by the commotion, his expression carefully arranged between concern and alarm. Harrington saw him and seized the opportunity. "Dean Whitmore," he said, "this has become an inappropriate public spectacle." The dean looked from Harrington to Evelyn, then to the board, then to the sea of students recording every second. His face changed as he understood the shape of the disaster. Evelyn closed her notebook. "No," she said, her voice calm enough to carry. "For 15 years, it was private. That was the problem." Dean Charles Whitmore had spent 22 years learning how to keep Harvard calm. He knew how to soften scandals into reviews, how to turn outrage into procedure, how to make a crisis sound like a conversation between reasonable people behind closed doors. But as he stood at the side entrance of Sanders Hall, looking at Evelyn Carter beside the blackboard and Professor Harrington beneath the weight of his own equation, he understood this was not a problem that could be escorted quietly out of the room. Too many phones were recording. Too many students were searching. Too many facts had chosen the same afternoon to stop hiding. "Everyone, please remain seated," Whitmore said, raising both hands in the careful, measured way administrators use when they want authority without panic. "We need to pause and handle this appropriately." Evelyn looked at him. Appropriately is what people say when truth arrives before they are ready. The room stayed silent, but the sentence moved through it like a match struck in the dark. Harrington stepped closer to the dean, lowering his voice but not enough. "Charles, this is absurd. She is making claims in front of students. This should be addressed internally." Maya Reynolds stood from her seat before she fully realized she was doing it. Her laptop was open in her hands, the old symposium archive glowing on the screen. "Dean Whitmore," she said, her voice unsteady but clear, "there are public records. Her abstract is here. The phrasing matches his later keynote. The structure matches the proof on the board." Several students turned their screens outward. One by one, fragments of the buried past appeared across the lecture hall: scanned programs, citation trails, archive department newsletters, a grant summary from years earlier that referred to preliminary boundary work without naming its author. It was not yet a courtroom. It was not yet an investigation. But it was enough to change the air. Whitmore looked at the screens, then at Brooks. "Nathaniel?" he asked. Professor Brooks took a long breath. "The draft existed," he said. "I saw it. Others saw it. Evelyn asked for help, and the department chose comfort." Harrington's composure cracked at the edge. "You are oversimplifying a complex academic matter." Brooks turned to him with tired eyes. "No, William. We made it complex so we would not have to call it simple." That was the moment the room shifted from shock into understanding. Not complete understanding, not yet, but enough. Enough for the students who had laughed to lower their eyes. Enough for the visiting scholars to stop pretending this was only a misunderstanding. Enough for Maya to look at Evelyn and see not a stranger, but a warning about what institutions can do to people who arrive brilliant and unprotected. Evelyn stood very still beside her name on the board. She had thought the hardest part would be proving the math. It was not. The hardest part was watching people discover her humanity only after discovering her usefulness. Whitmore straightened his tie, searching for a path through the wreckage. "Ms. Carter," he said, softer now, "I think we should speak privately." Evelyn looked around the hall, at the students, at the board, at the rain-blurred windows beyond which the campus moved on as if history were not changing inside one of its oldest rooms. "Private is where my work disappeared," she said. "I will not follow it back there." Maya closed her laptop and began to applaud. It was just two hands at first, hesitant and small in the huge room. Then another student joined. Then another. The sound grew slowly, not like celebration, but like an apology trying to find a body. Professor Brooks did not clap. He simply bowed his head. Harrington stood alone. Beneath the applause, surrounded by the reputation he had built and the silence that could no longer protect it. Evelyn did not smile. She picked up her black notebook, returned the chalk to the rail, and stepped down from the platform. As she passed Harrington, he whispered, "What do you want?" She stopped beside him, close enough that only the first rows could hear. "My name where you found it," she said. Then she walked back toward the rear aisle, where her cleaning cart waited under the old brass lights, as if the entire room had not just learned that the woman assigned to clean the floor had been carrying the foundation of the board in her pocket. By the time Evelyn Carter reached the rear aisle, the applause had faded into something quieter and more lasting. Conversations began in fragments, not loud enough to become chaos, but too urgent to become silence again. Students compared screenshots. Visiting scholars exchanged looks that carried both disbelief and recognition. Professor Brooks remained near his seat, staring at the board as if the chalk lines had become a mirror he did not want but needed. Dean Whitmore followed Evelyn with careful steps, keeping a respectful distance now, as if he had finally understood that authority had changed hands without a vote, without a title, without anyone granting permission. "Ms. Carter," he said, "there will be a formal review." Evelyn placed both hands on the handle of her cleaning cart. The yellow bucket, the folded towels, the bottle of floor solution, all of it looked painfully ordinary beneath the old brass lights. "There should have been one 15 years ago," she said. Whitmore lowered his eyes. He had no answer that did not sound like another hallway, another delay, another polished sentence designed to survive without meaning anything. Harrington stood near the platform, surrounded by people but completely alone. The board behind him still carried two versions of the same truth, his mistake, and Evelyn's correction. The name Carter remained in the upper right corner, simple and impossible to push back into darkness. Maya Reynolds walked down the aisle slowly, holding her laptop against her chest. She stopped beside Evelyn, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether anything she could say would be enough. Evelyn looked at her and softened for the first time that afternoon. "You were right to question the third line," she said. Maya blinked, and the word struck her harder than applause. In a place where she had spent months wondering whether her doubts made her unprepared, Evelyn had given her something no seminar had offered: confirmation. "How did you keep going?" Maya asked quietly. Evelyn glanced toward the board. "Some days I did not," she said. "Some days I only kept breathing, paying bills, showing up, and doing the next small thing. People like to imagine strength as a grand moment. Most of the time, it is just not letting the world convince you that your mind belongs to someone else." Maya nodded, holding the sentence like a note she would need later. Then Evelyn reached into her cart, lifted the mop, and carried it toward the front of the room. The hall quieted again, confused by the movement. She walked past Whitmore, past Brooks, past Harrington, and placed the mop gently across the long faculty table beneath the board. It did not land loudly. It did not need to. In that room of degrees, awards, and framed authority, the mop became a witness. Evelyn turned to the dean. "For 15 years, I cleaned the rooms where men repeated my work," she said. "I am done cleaning up after them." No one moved. Then Brooks stepped forward and removed his faculty pin from his lapel. He set it on the table beside the mop, his hand trembling. "Then I will start by cleaning up my part," he said. Harrington looked at him, stunned. Whitmore looked as if the floor had shifted beneath the entire institution. Outside Sanders Hall, the rain had stopped. A pale evening light pushed through the tall windows, catching the chalk dust still floating in the air. Evelyn picked up her black notebook and walked toward the exit, not rushed, not triumphant, simply finished with being invisible. But as she reached the door, Maya called after her. "Ms. Carter, wait." Evelyn turned. Maya held up the notebook Evelyn had briefly set on the faculty table. A loose page had slipped from the back pocket and fallen open. It was covered in equations, diagrams, and 7 headings written in Evelyn's careful hand. Not old work. New work. Problems no one in that room had ever seen. Brooks stared at the page, and his face changed all over again. "Evelyn," he whispered, "what is this?" Evelyn looked at the page, then at the board, then at the room that had finally learned to be quiet for the right reason. "That," she said,